There's a piece of advice so deeply embedded in how we talk about healing, forgiveness, and moving forward that almost nobody thinks to question it, even when following it causes genuine, ongoing harm to the person trying so desperately to apply it correctly. Forgive, and you'll finally be free. This advice isn't wrong exactly. Forgiveness genuinely can be liberating, genuinely can release someone from the corrosive weight of carrying resentment indefinitely. But somewhere in the process of turning this idea into a universal prescription, something crucial got lost. The recognition that not every wound is actually built for forgiveness in the way this advice assumes, and that pushing yourself to forgive certain kinds of disrespect before you're genuinely ready, or in situations where forgiveness was never actually the right medicine in the first place, can cause more damage than the original wound itself. Today, we're going to talk about something almost nobody gives you permission to say out loud. There is a category of disrespect that should never be forgiven. Not because you're broken for struggling to let it go. Not because you lack the spiritual maturity everyone insists forgiveness requires, but because certain violations exist specifically to teach you something essential about your own worth, and forgiving them prematurely, or forgiving them at all, risks erasing exactly the lesson that violation was trying, however painfully, to teach you. Let's start by dismantling the assumption that makes this conversation necessary in the first place. The assumption that forgiveness is always, universally, the healthier, more evolved choice, regardless of what actually happened or who actually did it. This assumption exists partly because forgiveness genuinely does serve an important function in most ordinary human conflict. When someone makes a mistake, even a painful one, forgiveness allows both people to move forward without permanently carrying resentment that serves no productive purpose. This kind of forgiveness makes sense when applied to ordinary human imperfection: the friend who forgot an important date, the family member who said something thoughtless during a stressful moment, the partner who made a genuine mistake and demonstrated real accountability and change afterward. But somewhere along the way, this reasonable application of forgiveness got extended, almost without anyone consciously deciding to extend it, to situations categorically different from ordinary human imperfection. It got applied to deliberate, calculated cruelty. It got applied to sustained patterns of disrespect that revealed something fundamental and unchanging about someone's character, rather than an isolated lapse in an otherwise decent person's judgment. It got applied, most dangerously of all, to situations where the person causing harm never actually demonstrated any genuine accountability, any real change, any evidence that forgiveness would be met with anything other than continued disrespect, delivered with renewed confidence that consequences simply don't apply to them. This is precisely where the universal prescription for forgiveness starts causing genuine harm, because it strips away crucial distinctions that actually matter enormously when determining whether forgiveness serves your healing or actively undermines it. Let's talk about what actually distinguishes disrespect that might genuinely benefit from forgiveness from disrespect that shouldn't be forgiven, because this distinction is crucial to understanding today's entire conversation. The first crucial factor involves intentionality. There's a fundamental difference between harm that emerges from someone's genuine limitation, someone doing their imperfect best within the constraints of their own psychology, their own trauma, their own incomplete understanding, and harm that's deployed deliberately, strategically, with full awareness of the pain it will cause, precisely because that pain serves some purpose for the person causing it. The first category often does deserve consideration for forgiveness, because it emerges from something closer to genuine human fallibility than calculated cruelty. The second category exists in an entirely different moral universe, one where forgiveness risks something forgiveness was never actually designed to handle, validating a choice, not just an accident. Think about the difference between a partner who, in a moment of genuine stress and poor judgment, says something hurtful they immediately regret, apologize for sincerely, and never repeat, versus a partner who deploys specific, targeted cruelty repeatedly, strategically, precisely because they've learned exactly which words produce maximum damage and continues using this knowledge as a tool of control regardless of how much pain it demonstrably causes. These are not the same category of harm, even though both might initially look similar from the outside, both involving hurtful words spoken in anger. The first scenario involves someone whose actions don't match who they actually are or who they're trying to become. The second involves someone whose actions reveal, with increasing clarity over time, exactly who they actually are, regardless of what performance of remorse or change might occasionally accompany the pattern. Forgiveness makes profound sense in the first scenario because it acknowledges genuine human fallibility while allowing space for growth and repair. Forgiveness becomes something entirely different in the second scenario, something that risks functioning less like healing and more like permission, however unintentionally, for the pattern to continue with renewed confidence that whatever consequences might have followed have now been officially generously waived. This brings us to the second crucial factor that distinguishes forgivable disrespect from disrespect that shouldn't be forgiven, whether the harm was isolated or represents part of a demonstrated pattern. Isolated incidents, even severe ones, exist in a fundamentally different category than sustained patterns, because isolated incidents can genuinely represent an aberration, a moment that doesn't accurately reflect someone's typical behavior or character. Sustained patterns, by definition, represent something closer to a demonstrated truth about who someone actually is, tested and confirmed repeatedly over time, regardless of whatever explanations, apologies, or promises of change might have accompanied each individual instance. This distinction matters enormously because forgiveness applied to a genuine pattern, rather than an isolated incident, requires you to somehow forgive not just what happened, but the demonstrated likelihood that it will happen again and again indefinitely, regardless of how many times you extend the same grace that failed to produce lasting change every previous time you extended. There's a third crucial factor worth examining directly, one that gets discussed far less often than intentionality or pattern, but that matters just as much when determining whether specific disrespect deserves forgiveness, whether forgiving actually serves your own psychological integrity, or whether it requires you to betray something essential about your own self-respect in order to extend it. This might sound like an unusual framing, because most conversations about forgiveness focus entirely on what forgiveness does for the person receiving it, or what withholding forgiveness supposedly does to the person holding on to resentment. But there's a third consideration almost nobody discusses directly: what the act of forgiving specific kinds of disrespect actually requires you to believe about yourself, about your own worth, about what you're willing to accept as acceptable treatment. Because here's something crucial to understand about forgiveness that gets lost in the generic, universal application so many people are taught to pursue, regardless of context. Forgiveness isn't simply an internal emotional release, disconnected from any broader meaning or implication. Forgiveness communicates something both to the person being forgiven and, more importantly, to yourself about what kind of treatment you consider survivable, understandable, ultimately forgivable within the context of continued relationship or even simple peaceful coexistence. When you forgive genuine human imperfection, isolated mistakes, harm that emerged from someone's honest limitation rather than deliberate cruelty, this forgiveness communicates something healthy and accurate: that you understand humans are imperfect, that isolated failures don't define entire relationships or entire characters, that growth and repair remain genuinely possible for people who demonstrate real accountability. This kind of forgiveness aligns with reality, and serves your own psychological integrity, because it reflects an accurate, nuanced understanding of how human relationships actually function. But when you forgive deliberate, calculated, repeatedly demonstrated cruelty, especially cruelty that never received genuine accountability or produced any real change, this forgiveness communicates something categorically different, something that risks genuine harm to your own sense of self-worth and your own understanding of what you deserve. It communicates, whether you intend this message or not, that certain kinds of deliberate harm are ultimately survivable enough to forgive, that your own pain, however severe, doesn't actually require the person who caused it to demonstrate real accountability before you extend them absolution anyway. This is precisely where forgiveness, applied to the wrong category of harm, stops functioning as healing and starts functioning as a kind of ongoing self-betrayal, one that erodes your own understanding of what you're actually worth, what treatment you actually deserve, what consequences should actually follow when someone deliberately, repeatedly chooses to disrespect you, despite clearly understanding the harm this disrespect causes. Here's something worth stating directly, because it contradicts so much of the popular wisdom surrounding forgiveness. Sometimes, the healthiest, most self-respecting response to certain kinds of deliberate, repeated cruelty isn't forgiveness at all. It's clarity. It's the refusal to soften, reframe, or ultimately absolve behavior that revealed, with painful consistency, exactly who someone actually is, regardless of whatever performance of change or remorse might have periodically accompanied the pattern. This clarity isn't the same thing as bitterness, though the two can superficially resemble each other if examined only from the outside. Bitterness involves continued emotional entanglement with the person who caused harm, an ongoing preoccupation with their behavior that keeps you tethered to them long after any practical relationship has ended. Clarity, by contrast, involves something entirely different, simply permanently understanding what happened accurately, without requiring yourself to reframe deliberate cruelty into something more forgivable than it actually was, in order to finally achieve the peace everyone insists forgiveness is supposed to provide. Here's what makes this distinction so important, and it's worth examining directly, because it addresses the actual mechanism through which unforgiven clarity, rather than forced forgiveness, often produces genuine, lasting peace in ways that premature or misapplied forgiveness simply cannot achieve. When you refuse to forgive deliberate, sustained cruelty, you're not remaining trapped in anger or resentment indefinitely, contrary to what universal forgiveness advice often implies. You're simply refusing to distort your own accurate understanding of what happened in order to make the story more palatable, more spiritually evolved sounding, more consistent with an idea of healing that was never actually designed to handle the specific category of harm you experienced. This refusal allows something forced forgiveness, often actually prevents complete, accurate integration of what happened, without the psychological labor of constantly managing a reframed narrative that doesn't actually match your own honest experience. Because here's something crucial to understand about forced forgiveness. Forgiveness pursued because you believe you're supposed to reach it eventually, rather than because it genuinely reflects your own accurate assessment of what happened and what it deserves. This kind of performed forgiveness often requires ongoing psychological maintenance, a continuous, exhausting effort to keep believing something that doesn't actually align with what you genuinely know to be true. This is precisely why so many people report feeling strangely unsettled, even guilty, after successfully forcing themselves to forgive something that genuinely deserved a different response. This unsettled feeling isn't evidence that you didn't forgive correctly, or that you need to work harder at achieving genuine forgiveness. It's often evidence that forgiveness was simply the wrong tool for this specific situation. applied because you were told it was universally necessary rather than because it actually served your genuine healing in this particular instance. There's a final crucial distinction worth examining before we move toward what actually does serve genuine healing when forgiveness isn't the right response. The difference between forgiving someone and releasing your own suffering from being tied to them indefinitely. These two things get conflated constantly, as though they're the same process, when they're actually entirely separate. And understanding this separation is crucial to finding genuine peace with disrespect that shouldn't actually be forgiven. Because here's the truth that finally resolves the apparent contradiction at the center of this entire conversation. You can refuse to forgive certain disrespect while still completely releasing yourself from its ongoing grip on your life. These aren't the same process, even though popular wisdom insists they must be. And understanding this distinction is precisely what allows you to hold both clarity and genuine peace simultaneously, without requiring one to sacrifice the other. Releasing your suffering doesn't require declaring what happened acceptable, forgivable, or ultimately understandable, given whatever context or explanation the person who harmed you might have offered. It simply requires you to stop giving that person continued psychological rent-free residence in your present life, your ongoing emotional energy, your daily thoughts, and internal narrative. You can accomplish this complete release while still holding a permanent, unrevised, accurate understanding that certain behavior deserved exactly the consequence it received, without softening it into something more forgivable in order to achieve the peace you deserve, regardless. This distinction matters enormously because it dismantles the false choice so many people believe they're facing: either forgive completely or remain permanently trapped in bitter, unresolved anger indefinitely. There's actually a third option almost nobody discusses clearly enough, one that combines the genuine freedom forgiveness is supposed to provide with the honest clarity that certain disrespect should never be forgiven in the first place. This third option might be called simply moving forward with truth intact, releasing the emotional weight while preserving the accurate understanding, allowing yourself genuine peace without requiring yourself to distort what actually happened into something more palatable than it truly was. What does this actually look like in practice? And how does it differ from either forced forgiveness or perpetual unresolved bitterness? It looks like acknowledging, clearly and without ongoing anguish, that specific deliberate cruelty happened, that it revealed something true and unchanging about the person who caused it, and that this truth doesn't require your forgiveness in order for you to genuinely, completely move forward with your own life. It looks like releasing daily preoccupation with what happened, releasing the need for the person who caused harm to ever understand or acknowledge it accurately, while simultaneously refusing to ever reframe what happened as somehow more understandable, more forgivable, more excusable than it actually was. This approach requires a specific kind of psychological sophistication that forced universal forgiveness actually prevents you from developing, because it requires holding complexity rather than reaching for the simpler, more socially praised resolution of complete forgiveness, regardless of what actually occurred. It requires trusting your own accurate assessment of what happened, even when that assessment contradicts what everyone around you insists represents the healthier, more spiritually evolved path forward. This is worth stating directly because it's the truth this entire conversation has been building toward. Choosing not to forgive certain disrespect isn't evidence of your own failure to heal properly. It's often evidence of exactly the opposite: genuine self-respect, refusing to distort accurate reality in order to achieve a socially praised outcome that was never actually designed for the specific category of harm you experienced. Some disrespect exists precisely to teach you something essential about your own boundaries, your own worth, your own understanding of what treatment you're willing to accept moving forward. Forgiving that disrespect prematurely, or forgiving it at all, risks erasing exactly the lesson it was trying, however painfully, to teach you. This doesn't mean permanent anger, permanent bitterness, permanent preoccupation with the person who caused this harm. It means something more sophisticated than either forced forgiveness or perpetual resentment. Genuine release, combined with permanent unrevised clarity about what actually happened and what it revealed. You get to move forward completely, build a genuinely peaceful life, direct your energy entirely toward your own future and your own well-being, without ever requiring yourself to believe that what happened was ultimately acceptable, forgivable, or excusable given whatever context surrounded it. This is what genuine peace actually looks like when applied to disrespect that shouldn't be forgiven. Not bitter, ongoing preoccupation with the person who harmed you, but calm, settled clarity that exists independently of whether you've extended them the absolution everyone insists you're supposed to eventually provide. You remember what happened accurately. You understand what it revealed about someone's character. You allow that understanding to inform your future boundaries, your future discernment, your future protection against similar patterns from anyone else who might eventually attempt them. And you do all of this while simultaneously completely releasing the daily emotional weight of carrying that person and what they did as an active presence in your ongoing life. If you've spent time feeling guilty, spiritually inadequate, or somehow broken for your inability to forgive specific deliberate cruelty, understand exactly what that inability might actually represent. It's not evidence that you're less evolved, less compassionate, less capable of the healing everyone insists forgiveness universally provides. It might simply be evidence that your own psychological integrity, your own accurate understanding of what happened, is refusing to let you distort reality in service of an outcome that was never actually designed for what you specifically experienced. Some disrespect should never be forgiven, not because forgiveness itself is wrong, but because certain violations deserve to remain exactly what they were: clear, unrevised evidence of who someone actually is, preserved accurately rather than softened into something more comfortable to carry. This preservation isn't a failure of your healing. It's proof that your healing was never actually going to require you to lie to yourself about what you survived. You get to release the weight. You get to build a genuinely peaceful life. And you get to do both while still permanently refusing to call what happened to you anything other than exactly what it actually was.